This episode is sponsored by Quark's Bar, where the Dabo tables are just as hot as the girlies.
Now, as you all know, Mother's Day is coming up, and I thought it might be fun to talk about some of the famous moms throughout history who
owned slaves.
Fact, it is impossible for me to watch this episode without thinking about that one YouTube poop where Peggy says, "How does that Jacob Jingleheimer shit go again?" Fact!
We got any cereal?
I believe we do.
Sigh. Okay, so now that I got that out of my system, it's time for me to be my usual professional self. And if you're someone who's been itching to see King of the Hill put forward a commentary on rural conservatism versus one of those screechy liberal women with dyed hair, then this is about as close as you're going to get.
Just go right around to the front.
I thought you said family values were in at your house.
Yeah, heck, that gal there, she's dressed kind of pro-choice.
Now, personally, just for me, I really hate both of these stereotypes. I roll my eyes at the idea of the stupid conservative stereotype because I think associating conservatism with stupidity is an easy way of dismissing it rather than address the much more difficult reality where many conservatives are in fact smart and well-informed, they are just malicious or self-serving. And I always groan in disappointment whenever the liberal stereotype of woman with pink hair comes up because it gives white women entirely too much credit when they are one of the most reliably Republican voting demographics out there. I'm out here in the liberal paradise of California, and I can only count the number of dyed hair liberal white women that I know personally on 2 hands, and how many I've slept with on just 1. So if these supposed liberal ladies are out there, my only question is, where? Dallas? Salad? But now I hear you say, in your typically refined voice, "Review to death, what are you doing, man? We don't want these sexy political hot takes in our King of the Hill reviews. Stick to the episode, you utter snack." To which I will rebut, in my humble way, that I only address subjects, for the most part, that the show itself brings up.
Please, that is so old-fashioned, Hank.
Yes, old-fashioned as in good.
And you know, real talk here, given that this episode hits unusually hard on some hot-button issues, I would be neglecting my job as a reviewer and a commentator, and you know what, an entertainer, if I shortchanged you and your viewing experience by skipping over these more challenging subjects and pretending they don't even exist, pretending that they aren't in the episode and actually a key part of what's happening in the plot. And besides, why would I want to hide away from these interesting subjects? Because I'm afraid of getting some mean comments, of rattling a few cages out there? Fear is not only the mind killer, it is also the death of discourse. So come on, viewers, let's roll around in the muck that we call discussion and see what interesting things we discover.
Just let us take care of everything.
So she won't have to use her brain at all then?
That's right.
Interesting.
But you're not wrong in saying that there is a whole episode I need to address, not just little bits and pieces, so let's get to it, shall we? And right off the bat, we are met with a very weird initial setup where Bobby is shown scarfing down not 1, not 2, not 10, but 4 bowls of fucking cereal. My lord.
Grandma, you put the cookies back in breakfast.
I don't care if his parents allow him to do this, that boy's about to bust. The amount of cereal and sugar and shit in there is just about to go like ham wild. Ooh.
What is that, oatmeal? Ugh. Better put some sugar on that.
And apparently Hank can't fucking read, as the box is practically screaming the word cookies at him. It's the biggest word on the box, but instead he zeroes in on that one little itty bitty tiny word and thinks the whole thing is oatmeal. You see, kids, reading comprehension isn't a scam. That's just a vicious lie perpetrated by Big Math. Oh, but for my own safety, I'd better not say any more. Talking like that in range of any STEM majors that are passing by is a good way to wake up covered in arithmetics. Ignoring that likely possibility, Bobby then goes to school all cranked up on Grandma's sugar cookies, causing him to be rude to this beehive baddie.
what I was going to
say?
Yes, what I was going to say.
Going to say, we heard the preview, now get to the feature.
Bobby.
Bobby. Bitch!
Also, big ups to Boomhauer's child, Kid Hauser, who's over there in the back. Too bad he's sitting behind Connie in one shot, and then the wall moves forward and he's obliterated from existence in the next shot, and then magically he gets rearranged and put in the front row? What the fuck? Look at that. That's crazy. That boy must have some teleporting powers because he is going places. That's almost as crazy as the school's nurse, who's out here showing us how off-putting those two little lines that make up Hank's forehead can be when they're placed on literally anybody else.
Mr. Hill, I've diagnosed your son with attention deficit disorder. He's probably had it for years.
What? Well, how come nobody ever noticed this before?
Very few people have access to the pamphlets. I do.
Seriously, those two little lines do so much to age this character up. Oof. Oh, but yes, she erroneously says that Bobby has attention deficit disorder, which is a plotline that is kind of showing its age here. This sort of thing was a much more common concern in the late 90s to early 2000s, as was the commentary on like, ooh, the fear of giving kids unnecessary medication.
I don't like the idea of putting my boy on drugs. Isn't there some kind of operation?
And yes, this is definitely a funny line from Hank, but personally, I would chew my way out of Kid Hauser from the inside to get a surgery that would allow me to focus without having to listen to Rain videos or without having to do an hour of internet searching before I'm able to write just this one line in this script. Sadly, there are no invasive brain operations available for Mr. Hill, only the threat of sending Bobby to a special needs school.
He'll have to wear a uniform. Can he button his own shirt?
You bastards.
So now, let's touch on one of the primary themes of this episode, the unnecessary medication of children. And is it really unnecessary in this case? Well, I'm not a doctor, but if I had to guess, I'd say Bobby's got polio. Okay, I'm not a doctor. I'm just a guy who couldn't get into a PhD program and who now writes fantasy books about men with blenders for hands, and, quite recently, a female pope who's been getting bullied by a monster clown girl that may want to fuck and or eat her. It's wild. So with that in mind, you know you can trust me when I say there are certainly some organizations out there that do have financial incentives for these medications to be prescribed regardless of whether people really need them or not, as shown with the whole Oxycontin debacle. But let's also acknowledge that there are indeed a whole bunch of people out there who are living through struggles that could very easily be relieved by popping a few pills. For me, I tend to lean more into the let's solve suffering with medication side of things, rather than the kids need to suck it up and realize they don't have a condition, they're just lazy mentality. And it doesn't really feel like this episode is taking a pot shot at kids who are getting medication, but rather the unqualified people, namely the school nurse, who are out here making faulty assumptions off of one-time incidents, which then take us down a rather silly path.
From now on, you'll be taking medication after every meal.
So, do I smoke it or snort it or what?
It's a pill, Bobby.
So, I guess I'll just pop it then.
Even though this very easily could have felt like an anti-medication message, it is more of a showcase on the exaggerated effects that can happen when the wrong kind of pill reaches the wrong kind of person. And in Bobby's case, these pills seem to have unlocked some sort of hypersensitivity powers, heightening his senses to some crazy bullshit anime levels.
Feel anything yet?
Starting to...
While Bobby is out here trying to understand his Nen type, Hank and Peggy discuss the situation further. And Peggy feels that their son's condition can be blamed on her and her alleged negligence as a parent, which is a terrible feeling that Hank surprisingly encourages.
Oh, sure, I'm a hotshot substitute teacher, but sometimes I don't even have time to make my own son breakfast.
Well, it is called attention deficit disorder. Maybe the boy's not getting enough attention.
In a fit of misplaced guilt, Peggy says that she's thinking of quitting her job and becoming a stay-at-home mom, an idea that noticeably excites Hank and which gets us this big laugh.
What am I saying? Quit my job? That's crazy talk.
Now, wait a minute, Peggy. Crazy is a very strong word. You're just thinking out loud. Bobby's crazy. Bobby's crazy. Bobby's crazy.
Editor's note here. I just popped in to say, like I'm watching this episode again, going through all the clips, and it strikes upon me like lightning from the heavens that this Peggy Hill person is being like a really fucking good person in this episode. I mean, come on, her little goofball of a kid goes to school, has a really shitty day, figures out there's all this fucked up garbage in his brain, and What does she do? She throws her whole career out the window for the little goofball. I mean, come on, if that's not love, if that's not looking out for the little guy in this world that typically steps on him with her big fucking feet, then what is? Who is in this world a good person if not Peggy Hill for taking care of her little baby boy? Her baby boy! I mean, come on. Ugh. And yes, by the way, this is how I sound when I'm not putting on the entertainer voice for all you people out there. Blech.
You know, I gotta say, the back half of this second season is really leaning into Hank's bluntness and, strange enough, his ability to manipulate people. And he's usually doing so in the name of the idealized post-World War II America, the era that brought us the wonders of Play-Doh, car airbags, and Velcro, all of which, by the way, are younger than Joe Biden and Donald Trump. It is crazy to realize that those two are older than fucking Velcro, which, according to Star Trek Enterprise, was given to us by the Vulcans. Neat. And my only real complaint about Hank's motivation here is that it feels like, I don't know, like a problem that should have already been put to bed a long time ago. Like, come on, real talk here, Hank. You married Peggy Platter, for God's sakes. What about that girl said housewife to you?
For your own good, I am forbidding you to go back there.
You forbid me?
Unless you decide on your own not to go, because I'll still support that.
Peggy has always been a very headstrong and active person. I mean, she's really involved in her community. She's got like this 2-year college degree. She has all of the softball sports acumen too, so like, I hate to break it to you here, Hank, but if you thought she was going to be a quiet stay-at-home mom, then, you've been barking up the wrong tree for quite some time. Of course, the great irony of this situation is that Peggy has a much better chance of keeping an eye on and supporting Bobby at the school at her frickin' job as a substitute teacher. Like, what? If Peggy were going to do this whole stay-at-home mom thing, then it probably should have happened about 10 years ago when Bobby needed the most attention when he was just a little infant. But now that he's actually in school, her job typically puts her at the same location and for the same hours as him, so this whole like, oh, I need to put aside my career for the sake of my son, is kind of at odds with what her career actually is. Although I will admit that Peggy doesn't seem to take the regular and much more common sub-jobs, the ones where you're typically in the class for only a day or two, but rather the jobs that require a long-term sub, one who also grades papers and does like set up lesson plans outside of school hours, which, you know, might take away time at home from Bobby, I guess. But there I go problem solving again, so quick, let's get a little silly joke in here, huh?
Do you know who I am? I'm Luann. Remember?
He has ADD, Luann. He didn't get hit in the head with a coconut.
Huh, they don't really seem to be handling this situation very well, do they? Peggy ditches her entire career, Luann seems to think that Bobby's gotten a lobotomy, and Hank, well, let's just say that Hank has a way of delivering very basic news in the most alarming and upsetting ways imaginable.
What you have is, well, technically they call it a disease.
A disease is not...
A disease.
But not a regular disease like you get in your body. It's a much more rare disease in your brain.
That's right, son. Whatever you have, whatever it is, has now spread to your brain. You're still developing an oh so easy to infect and, might I say, mighty tasty for the bacteria, brain. I'm honestly a little surprised that Hank didn't say that this was incurable and would be with him for the rest of his presumably, possibly not, but probably so short life, just to put the cherry on top of this shit sundae. But for now, let's ignore Bobby and his developing stand, Fatboy Slim, and instead see how Peggy is dealing with her first day at home.
Now that I'm not working, I had time to make you pancakes, and we've got eggs and bacon arranged in one of 3 facial expressions depending upon your mood.
I think the writers may have written this like first beginning part of the episode before their lunchtime because there is just so much food in this thing. I mean, we're talking about Bobby's 4 bowls of cereal, these 3 eggs and bacon plates, and muffins. Ooh, you know I love them. You know I'm a muffaholic. In any case, once Bobby goes off to school, Peggy immediately seeks out the bottom of the barrel of social structures and goes to the women that she spoke to in the sexual education episode, which is a very precise and very strange sort of callback. We even get the incredibly dark character of Bonnie, who once described having sex with her husband like this.
When my husband would crawl all over me at night and do his business, well, I would just close my eyes and think of them pretty flowers.
Oh my God, bro. Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck?
God, what a life she has. I mean, you're a stay-at-home mom, you're bored out of your skull, and you can't even find enjoyment in the most vanilla of sexual experiences. Somebody better keep an eye on that lady, because she sounds like a prime candidate for someone who would start digging up dead bodies, or even worse, someone who would start a cartoon review YouTube channel, which is a fate worse than death. Thank goodness that she and these other housefraus are able to cling to their sanity.
Myself, I clip coupons.
I think we'd all go a little crazy without coupons.
That's funny.
Okay, so while it would be pretty easy to throw stones at these women for acting like this, let's remember that this was all taking place in the pre-internet, pre-streaming, and pre-YouTube age. Let's take all of that away and throw you back into the sludge of daytime television, and hey, just for good measure, let's also put you in charge of a few Rugrats, and we'll see how long it takes you before you start cackling. Or, if you're not a big fan of laughing and are instead someone who's on the verge of developing your Mangekyo Sharingan ability, before you start looking for the imperfections of this crooked world.
There are 96 ridges on every checker except this one.
That boy ain't right. Thankfully, Hank's guitar needs some new strings or some shit, and Peg leaps at the opportunity to get out of this ranch-style rambler of a house.
You're leaving the house?
You don't have to come, Peggy. I'm sure you've had a full day. You just stay here and relax.
Let's go!
Get ready for the next battle.
I find it really funny how Earl's guitars have been this sort of semi-reoccurring location in the first two seasons, but it's even funnier that Earl himself, who probably has less screen time than John Redcorn or Buckley at this point, is surprised at how Peggy gave up on her job, kind of making us think that like he knows her pretty well, which is kind of just like a little weird for a character who doesn't show up like at all.
I never saw Peggy as the stay-at-home type.
Well, she's got 2 full-time jobs now, wife and mother. It's longer hours and less pay, but you don't hear me complaining. Seriously, though, we're loving it.
Oh, but Peg, boredom is not a thing which lives alone in your house. It is a state of mind, a thing which you carry with you wherever you go.
And as you behold the yawing chasm of droning seconds, minutes, hours, days, weeks, months, years, eternities, may you have the mental fortitude to stand against the waves of unending repetition that were given birth by the dread Emperor himself.
Or, you know, you can always take some guitar lessons. And this rather unceremoniously gets us to Emily, a character that is written with too much boring common sense and who isn't really confrontational in any meaningful way, and therefore she needed to have her appearance styled up in the most left-leaning way imaginable.
Filling time. Yeah, that's what I thought I was doing when I started playing music. Turned out I was really looking for a voice to scream with.
I have to confess, I actually really love that alien wearing the cat in the hat. The hat. Can you get any more vaguely 90s than that? There is definitely a reason why all those slime videos got popular in the late 2010s, as the kids who grew up with dripping aliens and slime time eventually got some money and decided to enthrall the next generation with their fascination with goo. But let's focus here and try to put those 90s fleshlights out of our minds, shall we? Instead, let's talk about Emily, who clearly had Orochimaru's curse mark sealed on her and, going by the symbol on her shirt, seemingly has a desire to be used as a women's restroom. Emily encourages Peggy to find her voice, which is an idea that Peggy eagerly leaps on.
I don't know if my husband would appreciate screaming in the house, but let's see. Ah! Well, he might have to get used to it.
Gosh, that sounds like me when I first saw my video starting to take off. Gosh, good times. And before Emily comes around to the Hill House, let's also remember that while all of these guitar lessons and pie makings are going on, Bobby is continuing with his godlike domain expansion ability.
There's some milk in the fridge that's about to go bad. And there it goes.
I love that his strange behavior is being totally ignored by both Hank and Peggy, subtly leaning into the idea that some parents out there would rather put their kids on autopilot rather than actually interact with their children. Anyhoozle, when Emily arrives at the Hill House, we get a joke that is somewhat recycled from season 1.
Hey, I'm looking for the Hill House.
The Hank Hill House?
The Peggy Hill House.
The name is Hank Hill. Mr. Hank Hill. Peggy married me. I didn't marry her. What are you looking at?
And when she arrives, we get a rather straight up and not very subtle confirmation that the guys are what we would consider today to be hardcore conservatives.
I thought you said family values were in at your house.
Yeah, heck, that gal there, she's just kind of pro-choice.
But please don't misunderstand me here. I am not arguing in any way that the guys would or should be anything other than conservatives. They are fine the way they are. As a matter of fact, I would even go so far as to say that I think that making the guys like centrists or libertarians or God forbid liberals or progressives would feel quite disjointed, odd, and would detract a lot from the show, as some of the best jokes come from seeing their traditional ideologies clash against an ever-changing world. I'm not even suggesting that the show should shy away from hot-button culture war topics, as those are some of the deepest buckets of comedic jokes and parodies.
Are you gay? What? No, I sell propane.
It's just that this episode doesn't actually do much with the ideas that it's trying to present. And sure, it will say things like, oh, that Emily is dressing pretty pro-choice, or it'll have a bunch of feminists hooting at a club, but those are very flat and unengaging jokes. They're just dead on arrival. They, just say the thing that they're talking about, and then they move on. That's it. Ugh. Compare these jokes to how eventually we get into the very tricky subject of corporal punishment and whether Paddlin' Peggy should be allowed to spank her students, including the horrible little bastard Dooley who pulls her fucking pants down in class. That moment still shocks and awes me. It's incredible. It's such this eerie, surreal, holy shit moment. It makes me gasp every time. Wow. But that's an entire conversation. That's a whole issue that spurs on this big character journey of self-discovery in Peggy. Who is she? What are her morals? What's going on with her? How does she navigate this thing that's being offered to her? It's a whole big thing, and it's great. This one tries to do something like that, making Peggy almost go on a journey of navigating traditional values, but she's never been a true traditionalist wife, at least not the kind that stays at home with her kid, so this conflict doesn't really resonate because it doesn't feel like her core values are being challenged in any meaningful way. She's not being asked to stop caring for Bobby or to give up Boggle or anything, she's just really bored. She's still the same Peggy Hill that we all know, and the one that the most handsome of us all love, and that's just not on the same level of engagement on whether or not she should spank her students, which would radically change how we view her character. And when you stack this plot and its jokes up to things like Paddlin' Peggy or that extremely amusing dilemma of Governor Bush's mushy handshake, this episode is about as straightforward and flat of a conservative v liberal story that King of the Hill is ever gonna do. But even with that said, this plot is clearly showing favorability towards the liberal person, Emily, as she is being shown as the calmer and less explosive of the two groups, the more favorable, the more reasonable, the more human of the two.
Feminism? Gloria Steinbrenner, that's what started it. Gerald Ford should have killed her when he had the chance.
For example, when she's invited to the Hill house for dinner, Emily is hardly what you might expect from her looks and actually keeps most of her thoughts to herself.
Just let us take care of everything.
So she won't have to use her brain at all then?
That's right.
Interesting.
I always got the impression that Emily knows that she's a guest in the house and is simply being polite enough to bite her tongue and not outright tell Hank that he's looking at the whole Peggy situation with the wrong perspective. The only time where she gets a little bit more to her point is when she's talking about Mother's Day, which sounds like it's a bit taken straight out of a Daria episode.
The greeting card companies invented this holiday in 1914, and now the whole country celebrates another stereotype of what women are supposed to be.
And if you were ever curious to see how Hank Hill would respond to Daria's presence, well, this is about it.
You're not married, are you, Emily?
In fact, Hank seems to have a pretty instant dislike of Emily, and I think it's supposed to be because she represents this big threat to Hank's ideal situation for Peggy, where she does nothing at all at home, but I kinda get the feeling that it's a little bit more simple than that. And I feel this way because Hank goes on to say this.
So, Emily, Peggy tells me you've been helping her write music, working with her and putting ideas in her head and such.
This is sort of an odd thing for Hank to say, as so far the only bit of non-guitar related advice that Emily has given to Peggy has led to Peggy screaming, so I kinda think that Hank's going through a little bit of the Elle-Felt Valentine experience here and just getting his shit rocked on the daily. As a matter of fact, Peggy sticks pretty close to what her basic values are throughout this episode and even clearly defines what her limits are to Emily, and thankfully Emily decides not to push those issues.
But no cursing and no cop killing. I'm sorry, but that is just how I was raised.
And again, besides Emily's appearance, I actually think the show was very careful and very deliberately keeping Emily from directly insulting or challenging the more traditionalist values of the Hills. Because those traditionalist values, at their core, are what draws a lot of people, at least on the surface level, into watching King of the Hill, and you can definitely feel Emily choosing her words very carefully, making her feel like someone who definitely has a contrasting ideology to Hank, but one who does not get very preachy about it.
I bet a woman in your situation would have a lot to say.
And what situation is that?
Well, you know, having to give up your life's work to make things easier for the rest of your family.
Anybody who's ever had an uncomfortable family Thanksgiving dinner can definitely relate to Emily here, and if we dig a little deeper, I actually think that the situation that she's being brought into is one that is practically begging for someone, anybody, to give Peggy a little guidance. I mean, I understand that we English majors have a reputation for doing the whole, ooh, these curtains are blue, therefore the character must be feeling sad kind of thing, but I would much rather have an over-analysis of subtlety rather than the giant red flashing, oh my gosh, somebody help me sign that Peggy is throwing out right here.
The shell was her home and her prison as well.
Whoa, there's definitely something to that.
You definitely don't need to have read Ferdinand de Saussure or Samuel Johnson to puzzle this one out. Although if I had to choose, I'm personally a big fan of the writings of Oscar Wilde, who once put forward the very interesting idea that critics themselves are artists, because to criticize something in a meaningful way means you have to have a huge degree of knowledge and awareness of genre rules, and be able to effectively communicate just how effective a piece is. Basically, any idiot can smear paint on a canvas, but you have to be pretty darn smart to be able to express to others why that painting is shit or gold. Can you tell that I miss teaching? Cause I'm starting to. But you know what? Teaching doesn't let me put stuff like this up on the screen, so I think it's better that I'm here in this space. But it's important to note here that just like Hank and Peggy, I have forgotten about Bobby, who is currently feeling the effects of equivalent exchange. He certainly gets a lot of energy for most of the day, but in exchange, well, let's just say, son, you have to pay a very particular price.
Paying attention all day tires me out.
Aw, poor little guy. You know what? I actually think he should eat some cereal to get his energy up.
I love you, Grandma.
While Bobby is spending the next 100 billion years in the teleporter from Stephen King's The Jaunt, Emily invites Peggy to a little jam session concert that she hosts in... Wait, the back of Earl's Guitar Center? Maybe I'm just getting held up on a weird little detail. You know, it tends to happen to me from time to time, but it seems strange that Earl's would have such a large space in the back for stuff like this. This space feels more than a little reminiscent, and honestly kind of looks a lot like the comedy club Snaps from the Traffic Jam episode. But hold your horses, we can't go to Earl's yet, as we need to see what Hank is going through, you know, his big character turn here, the point where he realizes that his view of things is more than a little bit misinformed. This process starts when he calls up his mother, wishing her a happy Mother's Day and telling her about the whole Peggy situation. And when he does, we discover that Hank has been misremembering the facts as they were.
Don't you remember that year I drove a taxi?
No. Well, wait a minute. I remember you had a yellow car when I was little.
Gosh, I just love this little detail of Hank kind of remembering a detail from his childhood and misinterpreting it, as it feels very true to form about how we all piece together the disjointed images of our childhood and try to form like this whole sort of like, oh, this is what happened in the past, but kinda sorta not really. Oh, and I should also mention here that we get a very special reappearance of a certain someone, and he's even dressed in the same attire that Hank is most used to seeing him in.
Mom,
I love you too, honey. Gotta go.
I hope you like it. I can't return it.
My God, the man's insatiable. He's an animal. He's just like me. He's just like me, for real. As Tilly is getting thoroughly checked for scoliosis, Hank goes into Peggy's office and sees the various bits and bobs that she's amassed from her time teaching. Even more telling than all of that stuff, though, Hank looks at her personal calendar and sees a perfect visualization of her life before her sacrifice and what it's like after. The use of pure visuals here is done exceptionally well. It says so much without having to directly say anything to the audience. It's just, it's brilliant, really. And before we hop over to Earls for the final confrontation, I want to bring up two other brilliant points. The first is Peggy's dream, where she dreams that she had not one, not two, not a John Redcorn dozen, but in fact 20 whole children.
You know I can't give you more children. I have a narrow urethra.
This plants the idea of Peggy's desire to mother more kids into our heads, which will become a very key plot point in Season 3, and is especially poignant for that season's finale. And I think that is a super strong point of prime King of the Hill, that character motivations and essential ideas are typically, if not always, followed up and expanded upon. And in much that same vein, when Bobby is talking to Luann about her recent problems focusing, he reveals something that is extremely frightening when you try to picture what old Robert is describing.
You must have caught my ADD. It was that time I sneezed in your face.
Oh, I don't remember that.
Well, you were asleep.
Chilling. Truly chilling. So it is now finally time to get our copious buns over to Earl's for the guitar jam session, one which has some very, specific messaging.
Met a guy in my boxing class. I slept with him before I kicked his ass.
What's her number again? I mean, this feminist mob is admittedly a little too aggressive to like, as they are much more of the stereotypical men-hating women.
Get rid of that control freak. Leave him. Fight corporate white male oppression.
But let's also remember that they are admittedly probably a little drunk here and are clearly burning off some steam in what is most likely the only safe environment they can do so in Texas.
I'm just a little bit flustered.
Stick your neck out, girl. Speak your mind. Look what he's doing to you.
So yes, they do feel pretty obnoxious, but just like how the guy's conservative values are being exaggerated, these women are similarly being shown as the more extreme and cartoonish liberals for us to laugh at. And while this episode is nothing to take too seriously, I mean, it's just a cartoon after all, I do want to say that in general, most folks are just going along to get along in their lives, and it is only in what I will generously call the post-Obama years that we have currently stepped into a more us versus them mentality. In truth, we, the little people, the voters, have more in common in our day-to-day lives with each other, no matter what end of the political spectrum you're on, than the politicians who allegedly represent us.
What do you think of charcoal? It's pure evil, right?
Hank, I may be a politician, but I'm not afraid to speak my mind. Now, if you'll excuse me.
Which is why I am really glad that King of the Hill very rarely gets this on the nose about these kind of topics, or rather, when they do it, it is usually done from a character-driven perspective instead of just creating a nameless horde for us to, get angry at, as they did in this case. However, while I am not impressed by the crowd, I actually do really like Peggy's song, particularly the lyrics. Now, for copyright reasons, I can't play the original version, but I will do a quick little spoken word rendition of her song. Here we go. The daily things that keep us all busy are confusing me. That's when you came to me and said, "Wish I could prove I love you, but does that mean I have to walk on water? When we are older, you'll understand. It's enough when I say so. And maybe some things are that simple. Whatever lies beyond this morning is a little later on. Regardless of warnings, the future doesn't scare me at all."
Now that gal can write music.
That she can, Hank. That she can. And with Peggy's song demonstrating her simplistic and cleanly love for her husband, we are presented with a commentary on how the people around us are what saves us from boredom and the uncertain futures that are out there. As Hank theorizes, Peggy has a little bit too much mother in her for one kid, meaning that she's at her sharpest when she's in charge of a large group. Plus, there's the little matter of Bobby's behavior.
I tell you, today I really noticed his behavior improve.
I didn't take my medicine today.
That's right, the Big B couldn't handle his bonkai, and so he pawned off his powers on Luann. And, how is she taking things, exactly?
Welcome home. I cooked your brunch, and I tuned your car, and I fixed your mower, and I ate the brunch.
Maybe we should read a little more about that medicine, Hank?
Again, I'm no doctor, as my peers who went into PhD programs are constantly reminding me with their continued existence and success, but it does seem strange that Bobby would be rendered into a near comatose state while Luann goes into Hammond overdrive. I guess this is kind of like the Leon Petard situation, where the effects are just whatever seems the most amusing or interesting at the time, which I do think was a smart choice. Comedy does tend to die on the hill of predictability, so it's good to throw us off a cliff every once in a while. And in an unceremonious fashion, that is the end of the episode. So was it any good? Well, I would say parts of it were. While Peggy's crisis may not have the strongest relationship to the Bobby side story, as we really don't see them interact much at all, that does feed into the overall theme of how unnecessary this choice to medicate Bobby was, and how it is mostly Hank fighting to keep Peggy at home and therefore push her into this crisis. And while Hank's desire, dare I even say Hank's hunger for Peggy to be a stay-at-home mom does feel a little forced to me, I do get a lot of emotional resonance from his dawning revelation in Peggy's office. Oh, and I have absolutely no notes for improvement about the whole Bobby stuff. Like, every scene in that whole, storyline there is pure, uncut Garugamesh all the way through. This is definitely an episode with a few warts and does feel a little funky around the edges, but it is still a really strong episode of King of the Hill. It's just I don't know, this isn't an episode that I turn on or I seek out to have a good time. You know, this isn't one that pops to the top of your head oh yeah, I definitely want to watch that Turtle Song episode, ooh. This one is more of a pleasant surprise, one where I find myself going, oh yeah, I forgot I like this part, good for you, episode. Or perhaps this one is simply overshadowed by the titan that is about to come over the horizon, the monster that signifies the death of King of the Hill's awkward childhood and marks its ascension into a truly explosive series. That's right, it is finally time that we talk about Propane Boom, the beginning of the end.
Propane at Megalomart?
Bobby, leave the room.
You bastards!
Soon, my friends, it shall be here soon. For now, though, we can say that this episode, titled Peggy's Turtle Song, has indeed been reviewed to death. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the Chuck Mangione concert, where living through catastrophe feels so good.